Hi there, Shawna Kugler, Office Manager for Easy Choice Realty. I wanted to do a quick training on how to fill out a purchase contract. So, okay, let's go ahead and go over the purchase contract. And again, this is the residential contract for sale and purchase that's been approved by the Florida Realtors and the Florida Bar. It's basically the first two lines, so we know we're on the same page. It's an 11-page contract. The first line, basically you're just writing down who the buyer and the seller are. Please understand that if you have multiple buyers on this, that each buyer will need to sign the contract, okay? The first section talks about property description. This is where you want to fill in the property information such as the address and the legal description. This is also where you're talking about what personal property is included with the sale. Understand that anything that is attached to the property, ceiling fans, light fixtures, dishwashers, sinks, those are all assumed to be included. But you're going to want to read this section and then check the box for anything else that the buyer is asking for or that the buyer is assuming is included, such as like a microwave or a refrigerator. There's also a section here that Section E, the following items are excluded from the purchase. If there's anything that the seller is taking with them, it's really in everybody's best interest to go ahead and list them here, so that way there's no confusion. The worst thing that could happen is you go all the way, get all the way to the closing, have your inspections, and then the seller takes something that the buyer thought was staying, and then you have a conflict right before the closing. So just to protect all parties involved, it's really in your best interest to make sure that all the boxes are checked for the items that are staying, and that if anything is excluded from the purchase, that it's listed there under line 22. Section 2 talks about the purchase price, and this is very important because this is dictating what they're offering and what type of financing and escrow deposit and things like that. So under Section 2, you want to basically put on line 24, this is where you put in your offer price. And please understand that this is an offer. Once you have an executed contract, if there's changes, so if somebody counters and they make a change to that price, please make sure that all parties initial that, okay, because that's very important. But line 24 there, that's where you put in the offer price or the purchase price. The line A, or the section A, talks about the escrow deposit. And for those of you that maybe aren't all that familiar with exactly how to explain escrow deposit, this is basically like a security deposit on the contract. So this is money that's due. It's held by a third party. As the broker, we don't hold escrow deposit. I normally recommend having the title company that's doing the closing hold the escrow money for you, so that you as the buyer's agent don't have to scramble at the last minute to try to get escrow money transferred. But it's completely up to you who holds escrow money. But the escrow money is due once you have a completed executed contract. The buyer does need to turn in escrow money, and that's where you would put the amount there on under Section A. Typically, and this is a completely negotiable item, but I will tell you that typically it's about 1% of whatever the purchase price is. Okay, that money does get credited to the buyer at the closing to go towards their closing costs and down payment, unless for any reason they cancel the contract. As long as they cancel due to a contingency in the contract, the buyer should receive a refund of their escrow money. But if they just change their mind, technically that escrow money should go to the seller because they took the property off the market. Okay? So here's where you want to fill in, when you fill in the amount of the escrow, you also want to put in who's going to be holding it. Any additional deposit, and this is a negotiable item, that if the seller asks for an additional deposit, you would put that under Section B. Section C talks about the financing amount that the buyer is getting. So for somebody who's going 100% financing, you would want to put 100% there, or 80%, whatever it might be. So you put the financing amount under Section C. And then balance to close, and if you read this, it's not including the buyer's closing costs. This is just basically their down payment. So if somebody's getting an 80% financing, their balance to close would be the remaining 20% minus their escrow deposit. So you have a couple options here. If you do it through like Transaction Desk, I believe there's a little calculate button where it will calculate it for you, or you can just put in, the 20% minus $1,500 escrow, whatever it might be. Okay. Section C talks about the time that your buyer will be obligated to this contract. So you want to put a deadline in there. If the seller doesn't execute the contract prior to a specific day, you want the contract will become null and void, so your buyer will no longer be obligated to the contract. Again, negotiable, but very typically we would do maybe 24 hours, between 24 and 72, depending on what time of day we submitted the offer, or if it was a weekend or a holiday, whatever it might be. But Again, this is something that you and your buyer can choose, but you want to put a deadline in there that your buyer will be obligated. And if the seller doesn't execute the contract prior to that deadline, then the contract can become null and void. The next section is the closing date. A couple things is, one, I want to point out that the closing should take place in the county where the property is located, but I will tell you that has been affected recently with all the foreclosed properties because all the title companies are out of state. But they will do a mail away to your client. At that point, you can choose to have it at a closing at a title company or a lender's office, or you can use the Lumsden office to have the closing. But the closing date, you need to put a specific date in here. And again, this can always be altered. You can always push it up or push it back, but you have to have a date that everybody's shooting for, and that's what you would put on line 49. Have bottom of every page, buyer and seller both need to initial the contract. The next part is talking about an extension of closing. So go ahead and read that, because it does talk about if there's weather, especially here in Florida, we do have hurricane season. So there will be certain times where closings could get extended if there's a hurricane within a certain vicinity of Florida, as I know a lot of insurance companies will stop writing. So this will just be talking about any kind of extensions of closing. But there's also other reasons if the lender needs additional time. Please understand that if you extend the closing for any reason, you do have to get an addendum that both the buyer and the seller sign agreeing to extend the closing. Okay? Section 6 is occupancy and possession. Unless it's otherwise negotiated at the closing, the seller should be completely out of the property, and keys and everything and possession will be delivered to the buyer. There are post-occupancy or pre-occupancy things that could be negotiated for the buyer to move in early or allowing the seller to stay later. All of that has to be in writing. Section 7 talks about assignability. You want to check what box will pertain to this contract. Very commonly, the buyer may not assign this contract, so the very last box gets checked. And the reason for that is because if you do assign it, then the seller will want to know that the person that it's being assigned to will qualify for the loan and agree to all the same terms. So very commonly, the buyer may not assign the contract, but you do have to check what box pertains to that contract. Section 8 talks about financing. Please understand this is very important that you fill it out, because depending on what type of financing the buyer is going for will affect the costs and the procedure for the closing. So if your buyer is paying cash, you're going to want to go ahead and check the box A. If your buyer is getting financing, you check the box B, but then you also have to fill in what type of financing they're getting and what amount of financing they're getting. So if somebody's going 100% conventional, you'd want to fill that in, or if they're going FHA, VA, whatever the percentage is as well. And then if it's contingent upon their interest rate, whether it's a fixed or adjustable rate, you want to fill all that in as well. And then you'll want to read the rest of this paragraph, because it does talk about the process where the buyer has to make application within a certain amount of days. They have to provide a loan commitment. So go ahead and make sure you read that, but that's basically the financing contingency paragraph. And then C and D, you would only check if it's an assumable mortgage or if they're purchasing a money note from the seller. All right, section 9. Now we're getting into closing cost, fees, and charges. Understand, again, everything is negotiable, but very standard that the buyer has their portion of fees, which is going to be provided by their lender for the most part, and then the seller is going to have their portion of fees, which would include title insurance, doc stamps, real estate commission. So basically here what you want to see is it breaks down what the seller is obligated for. So you can see doc stamps, owner's policy, title search, HOA fees, recording fees, seller attorney fees, and then other. So if your buyer is asking the seller to pay any fees for them, you'd want to put them there under the other section. And then also sellers are obligated for certain repair limits. And again, this is not an as-is contract. So if you have an as-is contract, it's going to be worded very differently because there's going to be no repair limits. Okay? But these are negotiable items, and I just want to point out that there's 3 separate repair limits. One of them, the first one, is for general repair items. Anything that should be working in a house, such as appliances, electrical, plumbing, roofing, air conditioning, anything that's like a structural or functional part of the house would be included under the general repair limit. So it's very common if people leave it blank, it would be 1.5% of the purchase price, or this is the negotiable item that you can put in a flat dollar amount or a different percentage. The second one is going to be for wood destroying organisms, and this is when your buyer has a termite inspection. They're going to be looking for mold and for fungus, for termites, for anything that can destroy wood. So that's a separate repair limit that again can be negotiated. And the third repair limit is going to be for like open permits, anything that might be existing on the property. So again, that's a third repair limit. So please understand they have three. All three can be negotiable. Okay. And then this paragraph will also talk about the fact that the seller is not going to be on the hook for like cosmetic items. These are things that are not working properly at the property, but they can't be responsible for like a stain on a carpet or something that just strictly a cosmetic item unless, again, otherwise negotiated. Section B there talks about costs to be paid from the buyer. If you're representing the buyer in this, the best thing you can do is have your buyer get a good faith estimate from their lender, because that is their disclosure, because you as the agent have no control over what their lender is going to charge. So you don't want to be on the hook to quote somebody what their closing costs are going to be, because their lender fees may be completely different. So the best thing you can do is have them get a good faith estimate from their lender, and then advise them that there's going to be certain things that won't be included in that. So any inspections they want to have, such as a home inspection, if they wanted to bring in a roofer or an electrician, those are things that are not going to be on their good faith estimate. Okay, but their good faith estimate would give them a very good idea of what their closing costs are going to be and what they're going to have to bring to the closing. Section C, and I'm not going to go over every single line here. I want you to kind of read it, but the gist of it is that there has to be a clear title on the property. You do see attorneys doing closings, but very commonly a title company is doing a closing for you, and they're issuing a title policy at the closing. Their job is to basically do title searches on the property and make sure that it's free of any liens or judgments against the property. You do want to check here who's responsible for that. So under line 132, you can check the, and very, again, negotiable, but very commonly it's the seller chooses the title company as well as the seller paying for the title policy. So make sure you check the appropriate box so your buyer doesn't get on the hook for that, which would be line 132. Seller will designate closing agent and pay for title policy. D, survey. Very commonly, the lender will require the survey, but if somebody's going cash or getting a specific type of loan, a survey may not be required, but the buyer still has the option of having one. But this is just basically saying that the buyer may, at their expense, have a survey, but you want to make sure that you check with their lender to see if a survey is required. Same for a termite. I didn't explain that earlier, but if your buyer is getting financing, you want to verify with their lender whether or not a termite inspection is required, as most commonly it will be. If the lender says no, then you should advise your client that they can still have a termite inspection, and then it will be up to them. If anybody ever needs recommendations for home inspectors or termite inspectors, please let me know, as we have companies that we've worked with for several years. But please understand that as the buyer's agent, it's your responsibility to advise your client that they have the right to have home inspection, termite inspection, survey, appraisal, even if their lender doesn't require it. Okay? Section E is talking about the home warranty. You do have to check here whether or not the buyer is asking for the seller to pay for a home warranty, whether they would like to opt to pay for their home warranty themselves, or whether they just don't need to have a home warranty associated with the contract. F talks about special assessments, if there's any kind of special assessments on the property, so you want to read that and explain that to your buyer. Have them initial at the bottom of the page. We're continuing on the special assessments. If the property is in an HOA, you do want to check one of the boxes to disclose if there's any assessments to the property, who's responsible for it. Again, if you're representing the buyer, I would probably check line 159 that says seller shall pay the assessments in full at the time of closing. A title company can always deduct from the seller proceeds to pay off any kind of assessments, or if, again, everything is negotiable. If the buyer is willing to take the assessment after the closing, you would check the other box, or if there's specific terms to an assessment, you can handwrite that in under the additional terms as well.